A tragic hero is a literary archetype that has roots in ancient Greek drama. A key characteristic of a tragic hero is an error or multiple errors in judgment that lead to the hero's eventual downfall. We can see countless examples of tragic heroes throughout literature who either have an excess of pride or make a fatal error leading to their inevitable demise. The question I would like to ask in this video is, might we also apply this term to historical people? There's much about a lost expedition that can excite the imagination. The thrill of adventure, the setting out into the unknown, and the wild speculation that occurs after the disappearance of one all lay the groundwork for a story that can quite closely resemble that of a work of fiction. Throughout the course of this video, I would like to explore two famous lost expeditions of history through the lens of the tragic hero archetype. The year is 1822, and John Franklin is returning to England after a near-disastrous expedition on the northern coast of North America. It is through sheer determination and luck that he survives to tell the tale. Known at the time as the man who ate his shoes, Franklin is no stranger to near-fatal experiences. He has survived being shipwrecked and marooned off Australia for weeks, seen his best friend shot to death in front of him during a naval engagement with the French, and had survived that battle along with only 6 out of 40 officers who remained unscathed. To better portray the character of John Franklin, it is important to first narrate the prior experience he had in the Arctic before his final expedition. On the expedition he has just returned from, Franklin led a group of experienced Canadian traders and native Inuit to attempt to chart the region bordering the Arctic Ocean. Before long, food had become scarce, and after the natives abandoned them, it seemed prudent to turn back. Franklin, however, in an act of foolhardy determination, was determined to push on until he was down to 2 bags of pemmican and a tin of dried meat before finally giving up. The ensuing return journey was a nightmare. It became so dire that the men had to survive on clumps of rock moss and literally laid down to die in their snow huts. Miraculously, they were found by a native search party and nursed back to health. Franklin returned to England a survivor of one of the most disastrous Arctic expeditions in history, in which 11 men died. Despite all this, the call of the Arctic would never release him from its grasp. For the moment, though, Franklin had other matters to attend to. He was knighted in 1829, and in 1836 was appointed governor of Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. He would soon come to regret this decision. The following 6 years are described as the most painful of his life. Franklin and his wife Jane, who will play a crucial role later in the story, didn't fit into the traditional upper-class society of colonial bureaucracy. A bitter rivalry developed between them and the colonial secretary, culminating in Franklin being ridiculed by the press and ending his term as governor. In 1843, he returned to England in shame, feeling deeply wronged. To Franklin, this was the worst of offenses. Quote, he felt that his honor had been stained and did his best to seek redress. This was likely a symptom of the Victorian society he lived in. In Victorian England, lofty ideals such as being noble and chivalrous were touted by the press and the upper class alike, and so, to an upper class man like Franklin, to have one's personal honor damaged was unbearable. However, no redress came. In the mind of John Franklin, something drastic had to be done. He needed something to correct his public perception, some daring public adventure. The real tragedy of the disaster that followed was that, in reality, none of that was necessary. Franklin's followers and friends revered him, and the English public had already regarded him as an Arctic hero. Even upon his departure from Van Diemen's Land, Franklin was sent off warmly by the island's inhabitants. Franklin's vain need for a sense of redemption caused him to become a tragic hero in this story. Franklin's expedition departed with 2 ships, the Erebus and Terror, on May 19, 1845. A crew member wrote home, "Do not get over-anxious about us if we do not return in the time you have fixed upon." However, as the months passed, none was heard of Franklin or the expedition as a whole. The public was stirred into wild speculation and became invested in the story. As stated in the Illustrated London News, the long absence of Sir John Franklin, the last gallant explorer of those seas, has excited in the public mind an affectionate and deep interest, amounting at last to a painful solicitude for his fate and that of the brave men who share his perils and his glory. Before we continue, the Franklin story would not be nearly as famous or significant today if not for the efforts of his wife, Lady Jane Franklin. One of the most intelligent and pioneering women of England at the time, Lady Franklin became consumed by the search for her missing husband. She bombarded Parliament as well as Russian and American legislatures with letters demanding relief expeditions to be sent. She became so well read in Arctic geography and climate that her knowledge rivaled that of lifelong Arctic whalers. Lady Franklin's continued and relentless efforts aroused the sympathy of the public, who became enamored with her noble pursuit of her husband's rescue. To this end, she succeeded greatly. 40 expeditions were sponsored to search for Franklin in the 10 years following 1847. In 1854, 9 years after Franklin set off for the Arctic, the first real clue as to what happened to the Franklin expedition emerged in a testimony of an Inuit native. The man recalled stories of 35 or 40 white men who had starved to death west of a large river. This helped to pinpoint a general area for searching, and in the course of time, numerous relics from the expedition were discovered. In 1959, explorer Leopold McClintock discovered the first human skeleton from the Franklin expedition on King William Island. The body was face down as if its owner had stumbled forward and dropped, never to move again. This seemed to corroborate the story of an Inuit woman. They fell down and died as they walked along. In the same expedition, McClintock recovered the only primary source from the Franklin expedition that gives some sort of explanation for what befell it. It consisted of 2 messages scribbled a year apart in the margins of a government document. This first, dated May 28, 1847, 2 years after the expedition departed, was optimistic, stating all well, and that the ship, which was beset in ice, would shortly be freed, allowing the passage to be completed that summer. The second was considerably more frantic, and contained the shocking message that Franklin had died a month earlier, and that most of the crew were starving. This was the last surviving communication between the expedition and the outside world. Over the next century, little more came to light regarding the Franklin expeditions, despite dozens more search operations. In 2010, Parks Canada began expeditions using sonar and other modern equipment to try to locate the location of Franklin ships. In 2014, they succeeded in finding the wreck of the Erebus. The Terror was subsequently located in 2016. Even though we now know exactly where the ship sank, still more questions remain unanswered, like what had killed Franklin himself, and how had conditions turned so bad for the crew in the intervening time between the 2 messages found by McClintock. It is necessary here to highlight one key factor that caused the legend of Sir John Franklin to be what it is today: the social climate of England at the time. The Franklin expedition served to illuminate the attitudes of Victorian England at the time to great people. In the mind of the public, a great man was someone who set out determined to fight through any obstacles that might come in the way, no matter how impossible the expedition seemed. If the Northwest Passage was easily attainable, nobody would have batted an eye about it. But it was the impossibility, the failure of previous expeditions since 1497 to find the passage, that roused the Victorian spirit. It was the epitome of the true Englishman who would sooner accept a noble failure than an easy victory, even if it meant death. If Franklin was a celebrated explorer before the expedition, he was nothing short of a mythological figure in the Victorian zeitgeist now, during the search for him. He had become a true tragic hero. Despite the modern search and recovery techniques that aided in the discovery of Franklin's ships, there are still those who have ventured out into the unknown from whom we have still found no trace to this day. Born in England in 1867, Percy Harrison Fawcett lived a fascinating life. He served as an artilleryman in Sri Lanka, a soldier in the First World War, and a top-secret spy in Morocco. His real passion, however, lay in a region he called the last great blank space in the world, the Amazon. In between his other engagements, he embarked on 6 expeditions to the Amazon rainforest, first as an army cartographer, and later on private funds. He experienced diseases, insects, and hostile natives, but, like Franklin, something about this dangerous region always called him back. What had motivated this unyielding persistence? Fawcett became intimate with the concept of ancient civilizations in South America upon reading the unusual account of a Portuguese explorer's 1753 expedition into the Mato Grosso region of Brazil. The account described how the expedition, after becoming lost in the rainforest, stumbled upon an abandoned city complex in a valley. This stone metropolis was littered with unknown engravings and symbols, as well as large statues, and showed signs of being affected by an earthquake. Fawcett's fascination with this admittedly dubious narrative planted the seeds for his later expeditions. Fawcett's journals show that he was no stranger to the occult. His first brush came early in his travels when he had picked up an unusual stone artifact. After trying to discover its origin without success, he eventually sought the services of a medium. The spiritualist, upon interacting with the stone, entered a lengthy narrative describing a vision that sprung to his mind. This vision was of a city predating any written history in South America, filled with riches and culturally advanced citizens. Elaborate religious rituals were performed, while copious amounts of gold were obtained from the rivers. However, a massive-scale natural disaster wiped out all of the inhabitants of this city, leaving no trace of their civilization behind save a few scraps, including the rock that was presently being examined. Fawcett became convinced that the city described by the Portuguese explorer and the city in the medium's vision were one and the same, and further that it really existed somewhere in the wilds of Brazil. Lacking a name for this lost city, Fawcett settled upon naming it in one letter, Z. Fawcett's search for the lost city of Z began in the early 1920s when he launched 2 expeditions into the heart of the Brazilian rainforest. However, he was turned back both times due to inclement weather, sickness, and exhaustion affecting his crew. After more than 3 years without a sniff at another shot, in 1924, Fawcett finally acquired the funds to embark on one more attempt. Fawcett knew that the companions he chose for this expedition must be tough and ready to put up with the demands of the jungle. For this task, he chose his son, Jack, who shared his belief in the existence of Z, and Raleigh Rimmel, Jack's best friend, even though Fawcett himself was not sure of his abilities. Despite both of his companions' lack of experience in the jungle, Fawcett hoped that throwing them in the deep end would initiate them to the rigors of life in the wilderness. Before setting off, Fawcett refused to disclose the exact bearings of the expedition, stating rather prophetically, "If we should not come out, I don't want rescue parties to come in looking for us. It's too risky. If, with all my experience, we can't make it, there's not much hope for others." The party approached Rio in January of 1925, where they officially began the expedition. They made their way through various small towns in the Mato Grosso region, though not without hardship. Raleigh Rimmel's foot had become swollen and painful due to insect bites, and at one point Fawcett had trekked at such a pace that his companions fell behind and lost him for multiple days. Despite this, they reconvened at the last human settlement before total jungle, with Fawcett optimistically writing in May 1925 that he expected contact with the ancient civilization within a month, and that, quote, "Thereafter, our fate is in the lap of the gods." The last known information regarding the Fawcett expedition comes from the last letter that Fawcett sent, dated May 29, 1925. He wrote from Dead Horse Camp, so named because it was the site where he had to shoot his horse on a previous expedition. In the letter, Fawcett expressed concern for both himself and his companions. He complained of the constant swarm of insects of all kinds, and of Raleigh's still bandaged foot. In addition, being 58 years old, he wrote of his waning strength. Years tell, in spite of the spirit of enthusiasm. The last line of the letter, addressed to his wife Nina, is famously haunting. "You need have no fear of any failure." After this letter, no more concrete evidence ever surfaced regarding the whereabouts of Fawcett's expedition. Despite Fawcett's warnings, numerous search and rescue operations were conducted in the years following his absence, though none were successful. Theories of all kinds flourished explaining what the fate of the expedition was. They were killed by hostile natives, imprisoned and shown off as a display of power, or died of starvation. Some believed that Fawcett's real aim was to set up a commune in the wilderness, where he and his son could conduct more occult practices, while others still maintained that they had reached their objective and were now living as kings in the city of Z. As with Franklin, the legend of Percy Fawcett grew tremendously in the years following his disappearance. The press, too, was involved. An American newspaper had agreed to publish live reports of the expedition's progress, with pictures sent from the rainforest, and continued to offer speculations about its fate. Unlike Franklin's expedition, however, Fawcett's location was never located. To this day, its fate has never been determined, and explorers continue to probe the Mato Grosso region for the answer to the mystery. Despite the inconclusive proof of the existence of Z, Fawcett left behind a legacy of huge contributions to the geography, cartography, and ethnography of Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. He also was one of the first to achieve peaceful relations with natives through respectful observance of customs and gift-giving. But can we see any similarities between Fawcett and the tragic hero archetype? It can safely be assumed that he and his party did indeed meet a tragic end in the rainforest. based on his unrelenting efforts to attempt quest into the Amazon. Even with his experience, it was likely only a matter of time before something like this would go awry. However, it is difficult to identify the event or tragic flaw that started Fawcett towards this inevitable fate. It could have been his reading of the Portuguese explorer's account that planted the seed for his belief in Z. Maybe it was the stone artifact and the mystic's interpretation of its significance that made the city seem out there, ready for the taking. One thing that Fawcett certainly has in common with a well-written tragic hero is his impact and influence on those who read about him. The work of Percy Fawcett has inspired interest into the exploration and cultivation of unexplored areas around the world, and his journals rouse the adventurous spirit of anyone who decides to read through them. In an earlier writing, it seems almost as if Fawcett prophetically calls us from the depths of the unknown, invoking the spirit of adventure from his final resting place, beckoning us to follow him. What have not changed are the silent rivers rolling on through the forests of the interior, for to them the passage of a millennium is but a day, and they still shroud behind their impenetrable veil the mysteries of which I write, and the curtain rolls back on scenes utterly removed from the everyday world. Come with me now and see for yourself.